Welcome to the second lecture that we scheduled within the framework of our course, History of the Political Relations between Israel, Greece and Cyprus. I'm happy to see you again, all of you from the University of, from the Ben Ghurion University in Israel, University of Cyprus in Nicosia, and the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki. Of course, you are not all of you in the same cities, so I don't remember exactly from how many different cities we are all together this Sunday. Please open up your camera so that we can be all together. I am happy to see also the director of the Bnei Brit International Office here in Jerusalem, Mr. Alan Schneider. I have to say,
hello, everyone.
and I say every time that we meet that without the help of Bnei Brit, this project would not have been realized. And I have the pleasure and the honor to have with us Professor Αμίκαμ Ναχμάνι. He's the deputy chair at the Department of Political Studies at the Bar-Ιλάν University here in Israel. He was the chair of the department, and it was that time that I met him when I prepared my thesis since 2009 to 2014, and since 2018 he's now deputy chair. Professor Nahmani specializes in the modern history, politics, culture, and society of the East in the East Mediterranean, and particularly in Greece, and Cyprus, and Turkey. In 2013, Αμίκαμ Ναχμάνι was awarded the Bar-Ιλάν University Patterson Chair for Mediterranean Studies. Nahmani's research and publications cover subjects like water shortage, civil wars, gender and nationalism, rape and war, ethnicity, the military in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern countries, Muslim migrants in Europe, intellectual ideas and intellectual history, and more. In 2013, Nahmani was the awardee of the Minas Nomikos Award for Security Research Excellence, awarded annually by the International Intelligence History Association, IIHA. Αμίκαμ Ναχμάνι's publication include 11 books, 9 authored and 2 co-edited, and his latest is Haunted Presence, Europeans, Muslim Immigrants, and the Onus of European Jewish History, published by the Manchester University Press in 2017. Close to 70 articles, book chapters, and research reports. And this time, and today, he's going to explain us about how were the relations between Israel, Greece, and Turkey in the 1950s. He's the #1 expert on this issue. I have to say that one of the books that are recommended to this course is Professor Nahmani's book, Uneasy Relations in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was published in English and translated in Greek as well, as you all have it and you all know. So the floor is yours, and
Thank you, Dr. Charitos. I'm blushing. I heard what you've just said about me. I'm blushing. So thank you very much.
It is, everything is true.
Everything. Okay. It's a pleasure being here and to think about this operation of having simultaneously taftochronos, you say in Greek, I believe, to have simultaneously 3 universities together. This is something that probably we should continue with this kind of teaching. Anyhow, I will start with Greece and Israel. And what I want to say about Greece and Israel is that much of it is applicable also for Cyprus. And what I want to say that Greco-Israeli relations, they've got their own raison d'etre. It is not the result of a crisis in Turkish-Israeli relations. I insist on saying this because people say, listen, only when you had a problem between Turkey and Israel, so then something started to happen between Greece and Israel. I object to this kind of such an observation, because I want to say that there are common denominators between Israelis and Greeks and Hellenists, and perhaps I will only mention a couple of them. We are all Western democracies. Our cultural orientations are Western orientations. We have geographical proximity. On the face of it, the 3 of us, Cyprus, Israel, and Greece, are secular societies. We are, Cyprus, Israel, and Greece are the only non-Muslim societies and countries and states between the Bosphorus and the Atlantic Ocean. Think about it. This is also something that is a common denominator between among the 3 of us. And I will start by let's say, the years 1949 and 1990. I'll give a bird's view observation of this kind of, or this stage of Greco-Israeli relations. The interaction at the beginning was quite low, okay? And this is something that should puzzle us, because we have, for instance, Greece and Israel, 2 countries in the East Mediterranean, without any real issue that should cause a conflict between them. And it was David Ben Ggurion, the founding father of the State of Israel, that, as a matter of fact, he pushed to have good relations among the countries of the East Mediterranean. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to have good relations with the Arab countries of the East Mediterranean, between Israel and the Arab countries. So probably the second best would be only relations between the non-Arab countries of the East Mediterranean and Israel. And may I mention only one thing, that see how technology affected our relations. Israel needed the port of Piraeus, and more than this, Israel needed the airport of Athens, because the range of aircrafts at that very time was such a range that you must land in Athens in order to refuel, okay? Now, the moment, so because of this, first of all, Israel very much needed the airport of Athens in order to have good aerial connections between itself and the rest of the world. Okay, but when the range of aircrafts and technology developed and the range of aircrafts was extended, that is to say, the airport of Athens, for instance, wasn't that important for Israel. I just gave you something which sounds very minor and very marginal in order to show you what were the things that affected the relations between Israel and the Hellenic world. Okay, so this was one example. Now, what were the interests of Greece? I'll start with Greece, of having relations with Israel after World War II. First of all, Greece was very much concerned with the fate of the Greek minority in Egypt. Okay, Greece was very much worried about the fate of this minority. Greece was very much worried about the Greek Orthodox Church in the East Mediterranean, in the Middle East, okay? Greece needed the votes of Arab countries in the discussions in the United Nations, in the Security Council, okay? Concerning various issues that Greece was involved in. For instance, It was the time after the Amphilios, after the civil war in Greece between 1946 and 1949. And the Greek issue, time and again, was brought before the Security Council, before the General Assembly of the United Nations, etc. Okay, and Greece needed the votes of the Arab world, of the Arab countries. Okay. Now, in November 1947, Greece voted against the partition of Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And it was seen, by the way, that after the declaration of the State of Israel in mid-May 1948, that Greece did its utmost in order to not have good relations with Israel. Okay, I'll put it like this. Okay, not in a very diplomatic version, but in a moment I'll give you some facts and details, and then I understand what I'm talking about. There were places where Egypt abstained in the United Nations and Greece voted against Israel. Okay. For instance, there were deliveries and import of weapons that landed in the airport of Athens. They were confiscated by the Greek authorities. They were on their way to Israel that at that very time fought for its life, okay, in the War of Independence. So what happened was that these weapon deliveries were confiscated by the Greek authorities in the airport of Athens. For instance, there were even hell divers. If anybody here knows the history of the Greek Civil War and the role of the Royal Hellenic Air Force in this war, so there were some combat aircraft that were on their way from the Eastern Bloc on their way to Israel. They landed in the airport of Athens and they were confiscated by the Greek authorities and were immediately by the Royal Hellenic Air Force. That is to say, at that very time, the relations were, as a matter of fact, bad relations. They weren't good at all. One issue that should be was quite of an indicator for the relations. You know, when the civil war ended and communism lost its battle in Greece, there were also Jewish prisoners. Among the communist prisoners, there were something like 25, 35 Jewish prisoners. There were ardent communists. Israel intervened on their behalf. They did not want Israel, a fascist country, they called it. They didn't want Israel, a right-wing country, okay, to intervene on their behalf. Israeli diplomats had to convince them, please, we will intervene on your behalf. We will do something on your behalf or in your favor among the Greek authorities at that very time. And as a matter of fact, you will have to surrender your Greek citizenship and you will be able to immigrate to Israel. They didn't want to do this. They wanted to remain in Greece and to fight for the sake of communism in Greece. At the end of the day, out of these 35 people or whatever, something like 25 came to Israel. I interviewed several of them. It's an amazing story, as a matter of fact. That is to say, the Cold War at that very time and the struggle between, you know, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, between the Soviet Bloc and the US Bloc at that very time, also reflected in the relations here in the East Mediterranean between Greece and Israel. And this is not the whole story. In a moment, you will hear about it. At the beginning, now, here is something that should give you something to learn about Israeli foreign policy. Israeli foreign policy has got two main assets. Without going into too many details, the Holocaust is one asset of Israel foreign policy, but probably even a more important one is the fact that we have good relations with Washington, with the United States, and various countries in the world think that in order to have good relations with America, with the US, you must first come to Jerusalem and have good relations with Israel. Okay, so that is to say, Israel has got, so this is the thinking, okay? Israel has got its lobbies in the United States, the Jewish lobby, the Israeli lobby, and these lobbies would do a service for you, okay? So you'll have good relations with Israel, and we will do some lobbying for you in the United States. So this is, generally speaking, this is the thinking. This is one of the assets of Israeli foreign policy. Now, Turkey did not have a lobby in the US. So Turkey needed Israel in order to have good relations with the US. Greece had, and probably has till now, Greek lobby in the US. So Greece did not need Israeli help. Greece did not need Israeli assistance in having good relations with Washington. Okay, so this is something to remember, because for quite a long period, okay, we are talking probably something since the early 1950s till the late 1990s, something like this, about a period of 40 years. As a matter of fact, this issue of having doing lobbying on behalf of Greece or to do something for Greece in the US, as a matter of fact, Athens did not need it. This is something to remember. Okay, now, unfortunately, in 1952, if you go into the archives of the Israeli foreign ministry, you find that Greece was titled as an enemy of Israel. And there were some derogatory and probably even humiliating expressions that you can find in the archives, and I quote, "Greece is the only Arab country that Israel does not find itself in a war situation with it." Okay, listen to this kind of observation of the relations at that very time between Greece and Israel. Okay, something happened since then. But first of all, we should know what happened in the 1950s at that very time. You could find that Israel at that very time voted together with the communist bloc against Greece, okay, in the various debates in the United Nations. You could find that Hellenists and Turkists, if I can say it like this, that is to say, Israeli diplomats that served in Athens and Israeli diplomats that served in Turkey at that very time were always conflicting with each other. Okay, each of them, you know, pulled the wagon to its own arguments and its own reasoning of the relations between Athens and Israel, or Turkey and Israel. The recognition of both countries was probably the lowest diplomatic recognition, only de facto recognition, not de jure even recognition. And this lasts up until something like the early 1990s. Okay, for 40 years, the recognition between the two countries, Greece and Israel, was only de jure, only de facto recognition, and not even de jure recognition. Greece, probably under British influence, saw Israel as a communist country, as a country that is being ruled by socialist parties, okay? As a country, I'll give you one of, what would you deduce, or what would you think if you find that there are no Israeli communists in Israeli prisons? You would say, okay, Israel is a democracy. Why should communists be jailed and put in prison? In Greece, it was interpreted that the force and the power and the influence of communists in Israel is so strong that because of this, you cannot put them in prison. Okay, you should read things that sometimes you are puzzled. How come people even wrote things like this? Okay, for instance, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, or the Israeli military, refused to have Greek officers coming to Israel and meeting them. They saw them immediately after the Greek Civil War, okay, when communism was defeated, as I've already mentioned. They saw them as fascist colonels, okay. Now, if you think who were at that very time, the Israeli, who were members of the Israeli Chief of Staff at that very time, okay, or the General Staff, who were the members? There were people who were brought up in kibbutzim, okay, you know what kibbutz means, okay? There were people with socialist orientations. there were people who even voted for socialist parties, etc. So for them to see Greek colonels was to meet, as a matter of fact, people from Spain, from Franco's Spain. Okay, they realize that when we are going to meet Greek officers, meaning it's like meeting at that very time Greek, Spanish officers from the regime of Franco at that very time. I believe that you know that Franco, I shouldn't go into too many details of Spain at that very time, but a lot of, how they said it, equal, a lot of parallels were found here, and you find them in the archives between Franco's Spain of the 1950s and Greek after the time of immediately after the Civil War. Okay, bear in mind the only place in Europe where communism tried to take the state, tried to take power, okay, and failed, it was in Greece. Think about it. The only place where communism tried to take a country in the Central and Eastern Europe, the only place where it failed, it was in Greece. So for certain people in Israel at that very time, this was something that if you meet Greek diplomats or you meet Greek officers, you meet fascist colonels. Okay, but probably there was another reason that did not allow the Greco-Israeli relations to develop into warm relations. And this was the Greek minority in Egypt. Okay, this was, as a matter of fact, an unbridgeable hurdle or unbridgeable obstacle between Greece and Israel. In a moment, I'll elaborate on it. Any warming up of relations between Greece and Israel was paralleled to another catastrophe. The first catastrophe was the expulsion of something of more than 1 million Greeks from Mikria Sia, okay, from Asia Minor, okay, in the famous transfer. I believe that you know what I'm talking about. If not, probably Gabrielos will give you some more details after the lecture. So this was the first catastrophe. Oh, okay. The second catastrophe that was an imminent one would be if Nasser, President Nasser of Egypt, would expel something like 200,000 Greeks from Alexandria, okay, in Egypt. The moment there will be any development, any positive development in Greco-Israeli relations. So this was really an unbridgeable obstacle or an unbridgeable hurdle between Greece and Israel. These Greeks, by the way, in Egypt was a country within a country. They enjoyed a lot of privileges from the time of the capitulations. I hope that you know what are the capitulations. This is from, as a matter of fact, these are the privileges that non-Ottomans enjoyed during the time of the Ottoman power, and as a matter of fact, they lived and thrived under the auspices of the foreign powers, okay, of the Germany and Britain and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc., etc. And this was something. A state within a state, you could call it, okay? Now, you could expect that in 1957, after the Suez War, and after President Nasser, as a matter of fact, expelled all the foreigners from Egypt, 1957, 1958, here, okay, probably a situation that we would love to have it, love to have it. No more obstacle, no more the Greek minority obstacle in the relations between Greece and Israel. It didn't work like this, because although these Greeks were expelled from Egypt, Greece still needed the Arab votes. Israel had only one vote in the UN, while at that very time there were something like, if you combine together the Muslim bloc and Arab countries, you had more than 24, at that very time, 24 votes, and Greece needed these votes, in particular concerning the conflict in Cyprus. The conflict in Cyprus, okay, was brought time and again to the United Nations, and this conflict, you needed these votes. Okay, now, when you proceed and you go forward in this history, the moment Turkey occupied the northern part of Cyprus, immediately a parallel was found between Israel and the West Bank, okay, and Gaza, that were taken from Jordan and Egypt in the Six-Day War of 1967. So immediately a parallel was done. That is to say, Israel and Turkey were put by the Hellenic world, or by Greece at that very time, as something similar to each other. Of course, this did not help the relations between Israel and Greece. You know, in 1982, when there was the war in Lebanon, it was at that very time Andreas Papandreou was the prime minister of Greece. Greece was the only non-Arab country that got a financial and economic help from the Arab League as a reward or as a compensation for its so-called good, or I would call it, for its support of the Palestinian and the Arab case. Now, it sounds as if I'm blaming somebody. I'm not blaming anybody. Okay, in a moment you'll see what we contributed to the deterioration of the relations. But what I want to say that relations could not thrive and could not develop positively when you have such a reality, when you had such a reality. I will now talk about the Greek Orthodox Church. This was probably a beam of hope. Okay, this was probably a beam of light for the relations between the Greek world or the Hellenic world and Israel. And I'll tell you why. Because at that very time, there was an attempt of the Vatican in the 1950s. There was an attempt of the Vatican, okay, of the Holy See, to internationalize the holy places in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, okay? The Greek Orthodox Church perceived this as an attempt of the Vatican to undermine the status of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate here in the Holy Land. Israel also objected to this attempt of the Vatican to internationalize the holy places. So here a common denominator was found between Greece on one hand, the Greek Orthodox Church on the other hand, and Israel as a third party to this how they call it, to this so-called understanding between these three actors. And you know, since then, relations between Israel and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate is something different from the relations between the state of Israel and the state of Greece. Okay, even when relations between Athens and Jerusalem were not good relations, you could have found to have good relations between Orthodox Patriarchate, okay, here in the Holy Land, in Israel, and the state of Israel. It reflected, or it was expressed in concessions that Israel gave to the Orthodox Patriarchate in Jerusalem, in financial concessions that were given to the Patriarchate. The Greek Orthodox Church at that very time enabled Israel to defreeze various places in order, I mean territorial places, in order to enable the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate to have not only these places or these territories only for agriculture, but also to start to build buildings on them, okay? So altogether, the relations between the Orthodox Church and the state of Israel was something different from the relations between the state of Greece and the state of Israel. Okay. Now, I'll tell you another thing. Take the 20th century. Greeks and Israelis probably experience, probably more than any other countries and any other nations, the most, horrible and terrible sides of nationalism and of the nation state. I'll give you, theoretically speaking, one or two sentences. What is a nation state? A nation state is a state for one nation, okay? A nation for one ethnic group. You understand that this is a pure recipe for a conflict, for a zero-sum game. I hope that you know what a zero-sum game means. For a zero-sum game, that is to say, only one nation or only one ethnic group could live in such a territory. So nation state meaning a country for one nation. Okay, so Greeks and Israelis experience probably the most terrible and horrible sides of this idea of nationalism. Greeks were expelled from Asia Minor. Greeks were expelled from Egypt. Greeks were expelled from the northern part of Cyprus, okay? I shouldn't elaborate too much, but because you know the Holocaustoma, you say, correct? The Holocaust and the expulsion and the murder, assassination of 6 million Jews in Europe, okay? That practically made several European countries as nation states, i.e. a state for one nation only, okay? Take Poland, for instance. How many Jews remained of million that lived there before 1939? Okay, so Greece and Israel experienced the most, I would say, murderous sides of nationalism. More than this, there is another common denominator that probably should bridge the gap between Israel and Greece. And this is both Israel and Greece experience foreign interventions in their internal affairs, in the conflicts that they are involved with, okay? Greece in Cyprus, Israel with the Palestinians and the Arab world, okay? Without elaborating too much, you understand that such a thing would probably cause a scandal in any other country, okay? If a foreigner or an external force intervenes in your own business, okay? A third common denominator between Greeks and Israelis is the issue of illegal immigration. Okay, we suffer from this, not in the scale that Greece suffers, okay? A fourth common denominator would be the involvement of the military in politics and in society. Greece experienced this thing the time of the colonels, you know what I'm talking about. But more than this, and Israel, you cannot understand Israeli culture and Israeli society if you do not understand how much the military issues actually affect our being, as a matter of fact, our existence, our language, our daily life. Okay. So both countries have experienced the military, the intervention of the military issue or military inputs in their life, if I can say it like this. Both in Greece and Israel, the effect and the scale of the importance or influence of religion is quite discernible, both in Israel and in Greece. Okay. The influence of the church or the influence of the call it the synagogue in Israel. Okay. Both countries have got their own, by the way, diasporas. That's something very interesting. If nowadays we have so-called, just for the sake of explaining myself, we so-called have an honeymoon between Israel and Greece. Again, I'm not terribly accurate here, but just to explain myself. If now we have a honeymoon between Greece and Israel, a major part of it is because the two diasporas in North America on one hand, the Greek diaspora or the Greek lobby in North America and the Jewish lobby and the Greek diaspora and the Jewish diaspora in North America, both of them pushed the two mother countries to warm up their relations. Okay, One thing that should probably, if you can predict something in our unpredictable territory or area that you live in, you know, the last probably 40 years, 35 years, Israel looks favorably at the East Mediterranean, at the sea. And I'll explain it. In 3 issues, the sea is most important for us. We get our fresh water from the Mediterranean Sea. Israel now desalinates practically like 50% of its fresh water. And this is not something to sneeze at. This is not something to ridicule, because if you take the area here from biblical times or even before to nowadays, water, fresh water, was probably the number 1, if not the number 1, the number 2 issue for conflicts. So the moment Israel solved its problems concerning water, concerning fresh water, because we have along our Mediterranean shore, we have a desalination project, huge desalination project. So first of all, we get our fresh water from the East Mediterranean. B, we get our energy from the East Mediterranean. Okay, you're familiar and you're acquainted with the gas explorations and attempts to have a cooperation, that is to say, Israeli, Egyptian, Cypriot, Greek cooperation concerning transport of gas from the East Mediterranean to clients and to customers in Western and probably even Central Europe. Okay, but we get now a major part of our energy from the East Mediterranean. Okay, so fresh water we get from the East Mediterranean, energy we get from the East Mediterranean, and these 2 things needed that the Israeli Navy, with submarines, with patrol boats, with any other weapons and missiles and this and that. Okay, Israeli Navy has increased enormously. Okay, during the last, let's say, the last generation, something like 25 or 40 years, something like this. So in 3 major areas, the East Mediterranean for us is now a crucial place. Okay, the sea itself is a crucial place. Okay, and no doubt, I believe that these 3 things, okay, particularly, let's say, fresh water and cooperation between navies, etc., these and probably even desalination of water. Okay, desalination of water, and as I've said, the cooperation between the navies and exploration of sources. These 3 things are bound, I hope and I believe, and I can prove it, so-called, as much as you can prove something in our area, that these 3 things might produce better cooperation and more cooperation between us, between Israelis and the Hellenic world. Now, should I, Gavrilos, should I have something like, can I spend something like half an hour on Turkey, Israel, or it's too much, or?
Of course, it is very important so that we can see also this factor and okay. The Cyprus issue as well.
Okay.
It would be nice if we saw in the 1950s, but as you wish, it is okay. Something that we can discuss afterwards with our okay. questions okay. and discussions.
Okay. Turkey, Israel. Turkey, Israel. You have here the mistress syndrome at the beginning, okay? The 1950s, Israel, okay? There was, let's say, there was cooperation and exchange of intelligence. There was exchange of military delegations, this and that. But really, Turkey preferred not to come to the world, okay, with the Israeli woman, okay? You hide her. It was called by Ben Ggurion as the mistress syndrome. You have relations with your mistress, but you do not present it and you do not introduce it to the world. These totally, I will now focus on the 1990s. In a moment, you'll understand what happened in the 1950s. That is to say, in the 1990s, two things disappeared from Turkish-Israeli relations. First of all, the mistress syndrome disappeared from Turkish-Israeli relations. Open relations, okay, the whole world knew about it. Journalists were invited to military drills, combined military drills between the Israeli force, Turkish Air Force, etc., etc. Embassies between Turkey and Israel were established in the early 1990s. The zero-sum game disappeared. That is to say, to have good relations, that Turkey was fearful. Turkey was fearful at the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that the moment she will have good relations with Israel, it means that she will not have good relations with the Arab world, in particular with the petrol-producing countries of the Arab world, okay? And she was fearful lest the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union would object, and probably would not only theoretically, practically, okay, would object practically to any good relations between Israel and Turkey. That is to say, this was a zero-sum game. Either you have good relations with Israel, that is, you say, you are supposed to have repercussion and detrimental repercussions emanating from Turkey on one hand, and from the Arab world the other hand. So these two detrimental repercussions disappeared. Why they disappeared? Because the Soviet bloc in 1990 disappeared, okay? And the force or the power or the impact of Arab oil disappeared as well, okay, as from the 1990s onwards. But these things did exist in the 1950s. Turkey was afraid that, as I've just mentioned, good relations with Israel would result in bad relations with the Soviet Union. Good relations with Israel would result in bad relations with the Arab world. This was the situation in the 1950s. This disappeared in the 1990s. I hope I made myself clear enough concerning this thing. Now, and you know, as from the 1990s, Turco-Israeli relations or Turkish-Israeli relations were labeled, were considered as probably the most crucial event in the so-called history of the East Mediterranean since the last two generations, something like this. Because the Arab world saw it as the greatest catastrophe or the greatest disaster that happened to the Arab world since the loss of Palestine in 1948. Turkish-Israeli relations in the 1990s were considered by the Arab world as probably on par, okay, with the loss of Palestine in the 1940s, 1950s, late 1940s. Now, in particular, Syria was badly affected by Turkish-Israeli relations because Syria was sandwiched, okay, between us and the Turks, okay? And Israel in the 1990s, in a moment, in a few minutes, I'll come back to the 1950s. In the 1990s, Israel experienced Turkification. What do I mean by Turkification? Israel changes its policy. That is to say, from supporting the Kurds and the Kurdish issue in the Middle East, Israel, as a matter of fact, negated and objected to the idea of an independent Kurdish state. Prime Minister Netanyahu, you know, in 1997, the first government of Netanyahu declared that Israel objects to the idea of a Kurdish state. This was something in totally, how they call it, a real U-turn that the Israeli diplomacy has done at that very time. Because as from the 1950s and 60s and 70s onwards, Israel did its utmost to help, in particular, the Kurds in northern Iraq. Okay? So in the late 1990s, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared that the Kurds should not be given, or should not get an independent country. There was a vehement condemnation of Kurdish terrorism. The Armenian genocide that it's today in the news, yesterday and today is in the news. The Armenian genocide, here too, in the 1990s, Israel does not support the trend at that very time to recognize the genocide that the Armenians experienced during the time of the Ottoman Empire. Okay. By the way, in a moment you will see that the Armenian genocide was the reason, not the Marmara in 1910. Last decade, the Armenian issue was the beginning of the deterioration of Turkish-Israel relations the last 10 years. In a moment, I'll come to this. Okay. According to Israel, there could be only one genocide, and this is the Jewish genocide, i.e. the Holocaust. And because of this, the Armenian genocide is not taught in Israeli schools. Okay, that's very in the only. So the Armenian genocide is not taught at Israeli schools. Israeli lobbies in the US supported in the Congress, okay, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, American Senate, supported motions against recognition of the Armenian genocide, okay? Israeli lobbies were most instrumental in the decisions of both houses in the U.S. against recognizing the Armenian genocide. Okay, Greece and Israel, by the way, military relations between Greece and Israel, another side of the Turkification that Israel experienced. Military relations between Greece and Israel were such relations that, as a matter of fact, before you supply Israeli military industries, supplied anything to Greece, it had to be approved by Ankara. Okay, as from the 1990s. And when military things were exported from Israel to Greece at that very time, it was bulletproof jackets. It was probably, detachable petrol tanks of aircrafts, okay, something which is in Israel, we call it pareve. You know what pareve means? It's not, Orthodox Jews do not combine meat and milk. So something which is not milk and not meat is pareve called, okay? So Israel exported pareve things, pareve military things to Greece, nothing that Turkey could object to it, okay? Greek officer told me, we get from the Israelis falafel. You know what falafel means, yes? But without the cheek balls, okay? Without we get falafel below aktsitzot. Explain it in Greek, Gavrilos.
Ότι όταν ήταν για να περιγραφεί η στρατιωτική βοήθεια ή οι εξαγωγές οι στρατιωτικές από το Ισραήλ προς την Ελλάδα, επί της ουσίας ήταν ίσονος σημασίας ότι πουλούσαν, ότι έφεραν στην Ελλάδα, και ήταν σαν να ήταν, για παράδειγμα, άμα θα το πω με ελληνικά δεδομένα, σουβλάκι με πίτα, χωρίς το σουβλάκι μέσα.
Okay. So, and by the way, the same selling of or exporting of military objects or whatever item, the same restrictions were applicable to selling military objects or items to Cyprus. By the way, Turkey objected to any parallels that were done between the Palestinian struggle for independence and the Kurdish struggle for independence. the Kurds should not get an independent state, but the Palestinians should get an independent state according to Turkey. Now, doesn't matter what is the personal attitude of each of us or whatever. What I want to say that from the Turkish point of view, there were no parallels, for instance, for the occupation of northern Cyprus or the northern part of the island and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza by Israel, okay? What we did in northern Cyprus or what we did in the northern part of the island is something positive. What Israel is doing or did in the West Bank and Gaza is something negative. Full stop. The Turkish point of view. Okay. Another thing. Now, as I've said, the moment the Cold War disappeared, the issue of the syndrome, the mistress syndrome also disappeared. Relations between Turkey and Israel developed and warmed up. Israel did a lot of lobbying on behalf of Turkey in Washington, in favor of Turkey and on behalf of Turkey in Washington. As I've just said, major Jewish organizations in the US were active on behalf of Turkey in the US, in Northern America, okay? What else? You could find that the United States was the third party of the Turkish-Israeli relations. That is to say, while the Congress was critical about Turkish civil rights, about democracy in Turkey, about journalists being jailed in Turkey, etc. And because of this, the Congress did not approve selling of weapons to Turkey. Okay, so the US was very instrumental that Israel would sell these things to Turkey. Okay, so it was the support of the US to this part of Turkish-Israeli relations. What else? Now, a bit of history now. I talked about the 1950s, but I promised about the Turkish-Israeli relations of the 1990s. I want to say something about the 1950s as well, okay? Now, Turkey was in support of Egypt remaining Turkey was in support of Britain remaining in Egypt. That is to say, along the Suez Canal. Because we, Turkey, at that very time, during the Cold War, probably these were the most, how they call it, the crucial days of the Cold War, the late 1940s, early 1950s, the war in Korea, Stalin still in power, etc., etc. So Turkey objected to the idea of Britain leaving the Middle East. So against Arab national issues, against Arab national aspirations that wanted Britain to evacuate the Middle East, to evacuate the Suez Canal, etc., etc., against the idea of the FLN in Algeria, of France evacuating Algeria. So Turkey was in favor of the Western powers remaining in the Middle East, something that went contrary or was in conflict, in major conflict with Arab national aspirations. You understand it? Okay. But at that very time, Arabs probably pursued the idea of neutralism, okay, to being neutral between the East Bloc and the Western Bloc. In Israel, also, people toyed with the idea of being neutral, okay, between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. Turkey said, listen, in the Cold War, you cannot be neutral. Okay, you cannot be neutral in the Cold War. Either you support us or you are against us. Okay, either you support the West as Turkey wanted, or you are against the West. Impossible to sit in the middle. Okay. Now, but something did exist, and I mentioned it in Turkish-Israeli relations, and this was the fact that was a very strong lobbying was done in favor of Turkey by Jewish lobbies in the US, concerning various things, by the way, concerning, as I've said, the Armenian issue, concerning getting loans from American banks, when Turkey approached American banks and even some international bank, the IMF, for instance, International Monetary Fund, and International Bank, when Turkey approached these banks and asked for loans, nobody gave her. When Jewish lobbies intervened, she got these loans. Okay, so Israel viewed relations with Turkey as something extremely important. The only Muslim country here in the Middle East, okay, Muslim country that we have good relations with, okay. With the rest of the Arab world, we are practically in war, okay, that from time to time becomes a hot war, as we all know. So having good relations with Turkey, this was something that was probably a major achievement of Israeli diplomacy. Okay, when Turkey became part of NATO, this interested Israel very much, because Turkey at that very Israel, there were only 4 military attaches of the Israeli military as from the 1950s till something like the 1970s or something like this. Anyhow, the 4 military attaches were in Washington, in Ankara, in Paris and London. That's it. So also Jews came from the Eastern Bloc, came to Israel via Turkey, also something that was very important from the point of view of Israel. Now, these things, as you probably understand, or probably you could imagine, arose both the objection of the Hellenic world on one hand, of the Armenian world on the other hand, of the Arab world for sure. Okay? So altogether, we did not enjoy good relations, or Greco-Israeli relations, or Armenian-Israeli relations, or Arab-Israeli relations, okay, if you can talk about it, did not, these relations suffered from various other developments here in the Middle East that did not bring about any warming up of relations, and you had to wait for the early 1990s to the end of the Cold War and the end of the, let's say, the impact of Arab oil to have a new situation here in the Middle East. Let me just, we are something like 1 hour after, or almost 1 hour. Let me skip something. One moment. Yeah. The idea was, this was probably, Ben Γκουριόν was probably the developer of this idea, was to have the periphery pact. That is to say, to have cooperation between the non-Arab countries of the Middle East and probably the Near East. I would start to specify them. This is to have relations with Greece, with Turkey, with the Kurds, with the Christians in Sudan, with Ethiopia, okay, with Iran as well, okay. This, it was, somebody called it a spectre pact, or a spectre cooperation. Nothing official was signed, nothing official materialized, but the idea of having good relations among or between the non-Arab actors and countries of the Near East was something that from time to time materialized. That is to say, Israel had good relations with Iran, Israel had good relations with Turkey, Israel had good relations with Ethiopia. But I want to mention something. These relations were limited and confined to military/governmental contacts, okay? Relations between Israel and Turkey were different. 1/3 was military, 2/3 were civil relations between traders, between importers, exporters, etc. And this is something probably you should remember this. Governments have got interests, but government change their interests. Today I love you, tomorrow I hate you, because for various reasons or for various interests. Traders, importers, exporters have one interest: to make profit. So, you know, I'll give you an example. When Turkey and Israel, when Erdogan and Netanyahu exchange derogatory expression, this and that, you know, that Turkey exported all its export to the Emirates, to the Arab Gulf, to the Persian Gulf, etc., via Israel. That is to say, you should see it, you could see it, okay? Ships and boats came from Aegean ports of Turkey to Ashdod or Haifa, okay, with lorries with Turkish plates on them, and in convoys of 10 lorries each time, 10 trucks, okay, each time, police escorted them, came to the Jordan River, to the bridges, okay, from there they crossed to Jordan, and from there to the Emirates and to the Gulf countries, etc., etc. Because Syria at that very time, and probably till now, was in civil war, okay, as from the 1910s, of the 2010s, 2011, etc., etc., Syria is in terrible civil war. So, you know, Turkish exports continued to be exported from Turkey to the Gulf Emirates, okay, via Israel. At that very time, Erdogan said all the bad things about us, and Netanyahu and Lieberman, Secretary Lieberman was Secretary of Defense at that very time, said all bad things about Turkey. Still, okay, commercial relations and economic relations continued. Because, as I've just said, government could change their interests. This is not applicable, or this is not necessarily applicable concerning, you know, civilians who want to make profit. Now, all these things ended, as we know probably, in the Marmara. Okay, in 1st of June 2010. You know what happened, etc., between this Turkish ship and Israeli Navy. There was something, if I'm not wrong, 10 Turks were killed by Israeli Navy. I will not go into details, something that should be known. But I have a surprise for you. And the surprise is, for instance, when I talked to people from Jewish and Israeli lobbies in the US, in Canada as well, by the way, and talked to them about, and I said, you know, the deterioration between Turkey and Israel started in the Marmara. They said, no, it started before. It started, as a matter of fact, as early 2000, where Jewish lobbies became reluctant to support Turkey vis-a-vis the Armenian genocide. Without going into too many details, it's not, this is Jewish lobbies stopped to support Turkey concerning this thing. But listen to how the Turks viewed this, and this is, with this I will finish this part of the relations now, of my lecture now. Okay. That is to say, it brought about a new thinking in Turkey. Okay, we need Israel to support us in North America. When Israel does not support us in North America, why should we have good relations with Israel? And listen, with this, and I want to read you this quotation. Will the Obama administration declare Turkey a committer of genocide this April 24th, the anniversary of the Armenian genocide? Okay, I don't know. At a certain point in Turkey's Middle East policy, those who are pushing the government to turn against Israel might welcome this development. Now listen, personally, I wouldn't care, the person who writes this. In a moment, I'll give you more detail. On the contrary, I would just thank God and be glad that a blackmail which has been imposed on us for so many years has ended. In addition, there is no administration crazy enough to turn its back on Turkey. That is to say, you could see Turkish diplomats would tell you, listen, we don't need good relations with Israel. We need Israel, or we need good relations with Israel in order to have Jewish lobbying on our behalf and Israeli lobbying in our behalf in the US. When this lobbying is not done, okay, why should we have good relations with Israel? So, I think that I'll stop here. Okay, we have something like a quarter of an hour, something like this, or even some 20 minutes for Q&A. I will be more than glad to, okay?
Thank you very much. And it was very enlightening, and for all the period and all the decades since the establishment of the State of Israel up until now, that you have focused on the relations between Israel and Greece and Israel and Turkey. I did not hear about the effect of the Oslo Accords. And because in Greece, the narrative of the Greek government, in order to normalize its relations with the State of Israel, and also the narrative of the Cypriot government to open its embassy in Tel Aviv, because as we all know, Israeli embassy, Israeli diplomatic presence in Cyprus was even in the 1950s, and the consulate has become an embassy at the second day of the Cypriot independence, but the Cypriot government did not open an embassy in Tel Aviv because of the Arab and Israeli issues that were all these decades. The narrative in Athens and in Nicosia is that since the Arab world is sitting together in the Madrid talks in 1990, after the first Gulf War, and the one after the other, the Arab countries started to talk with Israel, and in a direct way. And we saw that then Morocco and Tunisia and the Gulf states had opened in Tel Aviv, that you remember those offices, economic offices. This was the reason why Greece, this was the reason that the governments of Greece and Cyprus and Turkey opened their embassies. Of course, in the 1990s, we have the end of the Cold War, but the Oslo Accords didn't have been used as a reason to normalize the relations between the three countries, and Cyprus and Greece and Turkey.
Correct. Absolutely. I mean, the Oslo Accord. I mean, if the Israelis and Arabs sit together and talk to each other, why shouldn't we do this? We, the Greeks, the Cypriots, the Turks, no doubt about it.
But as I have seen, you were right, because without the end of the Cold War, how could the Oslo Accords could come up?
Absolutely.
Because
so that is to say,
so it is the Cold War. So let's have it in a systematic way. It's the end of the Cold War, which had created a new world. In this new world, Saddam Hussein did not fit anymore. We have the first war in the Gulf. And it was this eruption that Israel felt with the Scud missiles, that it was not the number one superpower in the Middle East. It could see in Ramat Gan as a Scud missile, and it was a reason so that and the Israelis and the Arabs could come together and talk to each other. So Greece and Cyprus did not have any reason whatsoever not to talk with Israel in a direct way. Yeah. And now, between the relations between Israel and Turkey, we have the de jure and the honeymoon in the start of Israel from 49 till the Suez Canal, till the Suez crisis. And then we have this how Ben Ggurión told that the mistress syndrome. The mistress syndrome was even before the Suez crisis.
Yeah, of course. Yes. What I want to mention something here. You mentioned the first Gulf War. Turkey took part in the first Gulf War. From the point of view of Turkey, this was a total break of its Middle Eastern policy. Think about it. From the end of World War I until the Gulf War, and some people even think or say until the Marmara of 2010, not even one Turkish soldier was killed in the Middle East. Listen again what I'm saying to you. I would have bought, if somebody would have offered me as an Israeli, have something like 80 years without war, I would have bought it immediately.
Of course.
Why do I mention this? Because from the end of the First World War, 1918, until the first Gulf War, Turkey gave a divorce to the Arab Middle East. No intervention in the Arab Middle East. Our orientation is toward Europe and the West. Okay.
Yes, nothing but we have the Baghdad Pact.
Yes. One more in a moment. There was one exception. In 1950, Turkey sent an infantry division to Korea, okay, to fight against communism in Korea. And she got a ticket, an entrance ticket to NATO. because of this fighting of this Turkish infantry brigade.
Also Greece.
Yes. Why do I mention this? Because when it was the Marmara event in June, 1st of June 2010, people said, since the end of World War I, not even one drop of blood of a Turkish soldier was shed in the Middle East. Okay, you should take what I've just said with a pinch of salt. That is to say, the war of Turkey against the Kurds, a lot of casualties on both sides, okay? Turkey considers the war with the Kurds to be an internal issue, nothing to do with Turkey's international relations, okay? So, but I just wanted to make clear this point because for some people, the beginning of Turkey intervening in Middle Eastern issues started in the first Gulf War, and you could find how they call it, a certain thread that goes from the first Gulf War until nowadays, when you find Turkish soldiers in Libya, when you find Turkish soldiers in Iraq, when you find Turkish soldiers in Syria, okay? And when you find something
and actually
like...
in Qatar.
In Qatar as well, yeah.
Angeliki is a student from the University of Macedonia. Okay. Please pose your question. You are to unmute. Now you can unmute. You are still muted.
Hello. Yes.
No?
First of all, great presentation. Actually, I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more about the Kurdish matter, because I didn't really understand it. Why the change of behavior of Israel about this?
Concerning the Kurdish issue?
For the Kurdish issue.
Yeah.
And I would also like to ask, and this is maybe both relevant and irrelevant question, I have gaps for for the history of Jews before the Second World War and the creation of Israel.
Well, this is not the issue of the lecture. What kind of questions? I mean, what is the
yes.
question about the second issue that you bring up?
It is really a silly question, but
No, it's not a silly, but it is not in the issue that we talk about. But
yes, I know, and this is why I didn't know if to ask or not. But I don't really know, and I would like to. How to say it? If they had before making Israel another country, or they were just people with an identity. I don't know if you can understand what I mean. No.
Εγώ δεν κατάλαβα τι λες. I haven't.
Να το ρωτήσω στα ελληνικά για να είναι πιο ξεκάθαρο.
Ναι, αλλά να είναι στο θέμα μας.
Οκ, τότε μπορώ να στο ρωτήσω την επόμενη φορά που θα έχουμε μάθημα.
Όχι, απλά να
γιατί το θέμα τους δεν είναι.
Συγγνώμη, να μας αποδείξεις ότι... Ένα λεπτό. Το ερώτημα που θέλεις να θέσεις θα χρειαστεί να είναι μέσα στο θέμα της παρουσίασης. Είναι στο θέμα της παρουσίασης.
Δεν είναι στο θέμα της παρουσίασης, οπότε μπορώ να σας το ρωτήσω, ναι, την επόμενη φορά.
Λοιπόν, we have decided that what happened with the Jewish identity before the formation of the State of Israel is not our issue for the meeting. If Professor Nahmani would like to say some words about it, I would be glad. What is important from the question that Angeliki posed, it is that change of the Israeli approach towards the Kurdish issue, and also a question that I have about it, how can you see it in the interconnection of the Greek approach of the Kurdish issue and the Israeli approach of the Kurdish issue vis-a-vis Israel? Because I am sure that you have examined that.
Yeah, you all know the case with Abdallah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, okay, in 1999, okay, February 1999, when Öcalan was kidnapped from
1 week before I finished my military service, and we were all sure for 99% that we will get some more months of military
I don't hear you.
service when I was... What?
You hear me?
Yes. The news about Öcalan came when I was serving my 10 last days in the military, and we were all sure that we were going to serve even more than 10 days afterwards.
Okay,
So,
I'm glad. First of all, Ms. Angeliki, it was not a silly question, not at all. First of all, and good you've you ask if I understood it, if I perceived correctly your question. You ask what, for instance, the creation of the State of Israel, what it has done to the identity of Jews in the world on one hand, in Israel on the other hand. This is what you meant, I believe, isn't it? And if I understood you correctly, and in a moment I'll come to the Kurdish issue, but first of all, concerning these questions about the identity, the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948, perhaps I'll start differently. You know, after the Holocaust, after the Holocaustoma, after 1945, practically there was no Jewish people. There were Jewish community remained, no Jewish people. If you, some sociologists and some historians have already examined it and analyzed it, etc., etc., the genocide of 1/3 of the Jewish people out of 18 million, 6 million were killed. So when a people suffered such a blow, what remains is really, you know, parts of it. Only atomization, okay, atoms, only particles of these people remained. And what brought them again into, or what resumed the identity of a nation and the people was the creation of the State of Israel. All these particles suddenly had something in common to help, to wish for, to assist, to pray for, etc., etc. Okay, that is to say, these communities again became a people, if I made myself clear enough. But more than this, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 created something different. Suppose you were a Jewish person in Greece, or you were a Jewish person in England, people started to blame you for having double loyalty. Okay, you have a loyalty toward the State of Israel, and you have loyalty toward the State of Greece if you are a Greek citizen. You follow me, I hope. Okay, so the creation of the State of Israel was not something that did not have its implications and repercussions on the identity of Jews all over the world. Okay, this is one thing. But again, we can have a full lecture about this. But I come back now to what you've just asked concerning what happened between Israel and the Kurds. As from the 1950s and 60s, for sure, Israel helped militarily the Kurds in Iraq, practically fighting against the attempt of the Iraqis, of Saddam Hussein in particular, to exterminate them. Simple as that. And the Kurds, and the Iraqis did not hesitate to use even gas, okay, in order to kill the Kurds. In Halabja, if somebody, probably you came across this event, I mean, the Kurds, the Iraqis didn't hesitate to use gas and killing thousands of Kurdish people. Now, what I want to say that the idea of having cooperation between the non-Arab parts of the Middle East materialized in having good relations between Israel and the Kurds. Military legations of Israel were sent clandestinely, okay, to Iraq and helped the Kurds there. And by the way, there are academic works about it already, and some memoirs of people who took part in it, etc., etc. As from the 1990s, where good relations started to materialize or to emerge between Turkey and Israel, Turkey, even nowadays, does not like the idea of having Kurdish independence, even around, not in Turkey, not necessarily in Turkey, but even around Turkey, because they say having Kurdish independence in the proximity of Turkey is bound to affect the Kurds in Turkey. I hope I make myself clear enough. That is to say, the moment relations between Israel and Turkey warmed up, the Turks asked Israel, first of all, stop supporting the Kurds in northern Iraq, and B, you should take, tell me what is, you Israelis, tell us, we are the Turks, tell us, what is your opinion about Turkish terrorism, about the struggle of the Kurds to have an independent state in northern Iraq, etc., etc. And then in 1997 came Prime Minister Netanyahu and said, listen, the Kurds should not have an independent state because this affects our relations with Turkey. We talked about it, okay? This is part of the Turkification that Israeli foreign policy experienced as from the 1990s vis-a-vis Turkey. Nowadays, it's different situation nowadays. I will not go into it.
Is it true that in the 1990s the Israelis were reportedly bombarding the bases of the PKK in Lebanon?
I'm not. It could be, honestly, not that I'm hiding. I'm academic.
No. It was on the news, but
yes, and there were also rumors that we were instrumental in Kenya. The Israeli Mossad was instrumental in Kenya in helping the Turks
in the Greek embassy, etc. Oh my God! Okay, yes.
I take it with a pinch of salt. Believe
of course.
We have enough enemies. We don't need to have more enemies. Believe me. But I hope I was clearer now. Probably I wasn't clear enough during my presentation. I hope I'm clearer now. Part of the Turkification that Israeli foreign policy vis-a-vis Turkey, part of the Turkification that we experienced was a change of idea or a change of attitudes towards the idea of Kurdish independence.
Actually, the Turkification came as an episode 2 of the Torata Periferia, of the periphery doctrine. It was, I mean, then it was the start that Israel wanted to have good relations with non-Arab countries and nations and entities encircling the Arab world that was against Israel. This was the periphery doctrine, and now in 1990s, when Israel and Turkey were talking in the with the lights on and not with the lights off, they had to find a way to change this doctrine, the Israeli doctrine of the periphery, for the Kurds who were in Iraq and in Syria. Do we have another question?
May I only, before we have another question, just 2 sentences, and that's it.
Even more sentences, not only 2.
It's okay with the audience.
The audience is just fine, and we don't have any advertisements, and no, it is a program without interruptions.
Okay. What I want to say, perhaps you should go now into the mind of Israeli decision makers as from the early 1950s or late 40s and early 50s. We were then, probably even now, but then for sure, a country surrounded by enemies. A country, now it doesn't matter who was to be blamed for this state of war. Okay, this is not the issue. But when you are under, you know, this impression of being besieged, being encircled by enemies, and being besieged and on the verge of recurring wars, okay, you could see people who were mobilized into the military, and then they fought in 1956 in the Suez War, in 67 in the Six-Day War, in 73 in the Yom Kippur War, in Lebanon in 82, and this and that. It does something to the national psyche.
Not only that, what are you saying about this psychology of being that everybody's against you? Let me come back to what you said when you started about the relations between Israel and Greece in the 1950s, late 40s. At the Independence War. And you said about the confiscation of the weapons by the Greek authorities, which were coming from Czechoslovakia and Poland to Israel. But on the other hand, we should not forget that the British were helping the Arab Legion of Jordan, and the Greek authorities of that time were in power in Athens thanks to the British.
Yeah.
So it is possible that this confiscation was not an act of Greece against Israel. At the end of the day, it was against Israel. But one, the British were against Israel. The British were pro-Jordanian.
Yeah.
And the second is that these weapons came from the Soviet bloc and the Greek authorities who fought the communists within Greece would not be 100% sure that these weapons were not sent in order to help the communists within Greece.
Yeah.
So this confiscation, maybe in Israel with this thought that Israel is encircled by enemies and here we have another one, the Greeks in Athens. But the Greeks in Athens then in 48, they were on war between themselves. And suddenly they find weapons from the Soviet bloc, and the British said, wait a minute, these weapons are going to the Zionists, but we help the Jordanians. So it is not only the Greek factor that played this role, also the British one played this role.
Yes, let me add something else here. As from 1939 to 1949, the Greek people lost 10% of its population.
Yes.
How many people know about it?
Not many.
Not many. 700,000 out of 7 million. Also, the Greek psyche or the Greek psychology at that very time was also as if a nation under siege.
Yes.
A nation under constant attack.
Absolutely, okay? Absolutely.
So as academics,
yes.
I have no inhibition and no qualms, you know.
No.
The entire side of that.
I mean, when the state of Israel talked with a patriarchate here in Jerusalem about the buildings, you know, in Harat Sofim, on Mount Scopus,
Yeah.
the Greek consul was present in those talks. It was, I mean, we see that Greece, or when Israel asked Greece, now that Cyprus is going to be an independent state, will you be okay if Greek Cypriots have normal diplomatic ties with Israel? And Athens said, I don't care, it is an independent state. I will not object. I mean, there were some kinds of ups and downs. The ups were little and instant.
Yeah.
And the most of it was down from that point of view. Do you think that this present love story that we have between Greece and Israel will last for long?
I think, first of all,
because everybody wants to ask that. I see.
Okay. I'll answer this.
So
I'll answer this, and I say something. We must. It's not as from the beginning. It was said that we have good relations because we don't. Greco-Israeli relations are good nowadays, so-called honeymoon, as I said, quote unquote, because of the crisis between us and Turkey. We should build the relations not on a negative basis, i.e., the crisis between Turkey and Israel would bring about a honeymoon between Greece and Israel. No, not at all. A. And B, I'll tell you something. I am concerned with something. More and more of the relations are relations between government/military relations. and between Greece and Israel nowadays. Only the day, when was it, last week, that a new $1.6 billion between Elbit and Greek Ministry of Defense, etc., etc. It is fine. It should continue like this, but I'll be happier to see 500,000 or 600,000 Israelis coming each year to Greece. I'll be happier to see civil trade between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece rocketing, okay, and spiral rocketing, and being in the scale of billions. There is no reason in the world that Greco-Israeli civil trade should remain $400 million, $500 million a year. Combined with Cyprus, it probably doesn't reach $600 million a year.
Well, there are small markets.
Yes, yes, we could have much more, and we have the potential to have much more. As I've said, governments change interests.
Yes.
But people to people is probably the basis for better relations. And I tell it time and again, I tell it to people that I tell it
in Turkey now that the governments are do not talk to each other, let's say, but the trade is continuing and flourishing.
Correct. What I want to say time and again, I tell it to people from our foreign ministry. It's lovely what we have now. It's a honeymoon and we should continue, but we should support it and buttress it with much more of people-to-people relations. Because as I've said, I mean, you know, we had special relations with Iran, with Turkey, with Ethiopia, with France, with South Africa, really special relations without going into too many details. All collapsed apart from, and Turkey was the exception that proves the rule.
Yes.
All collapsed because it was governmental/military relations. And with Turkey, although with government and military, it collapsed, still something, even nowadays, we have something like $3-4 billion civil trade between us and Turkey nowadays. Yes. So if you ask me the future, I'll be happier, and I see the potential because of energy issues, okay? Because of energy projects or assets, we have all the potential to have brighter future. Can we finish with this optimistic view?
We will finish with this view, which is optimistic, but it is also a practical view. Yep. It is not only sentiments, but it is also logic. And we know what happened in the past, and let's see what is happening in the future. The good thing is that without this approach, we would not have the fantasy and the vision to be together under this course, 3 universities of 3 countries.
Correct.
No, now with the corona, the original plan was for us to meet together and in Israel and in Cyprus and in Greece, so that all those boys and girls who are now, you know, within their screen, they would meet each other and and meet.
Next year.
Unfortunately, with this corona, it is not. It is impossible. One of the, I mean, the fact that new generations and researchers and academics and people should meet and be friends with each other. It is also something. You cannot imagine what I heard about the Israelis when I was, let's say, 10, 11 or 16 years old in Greece in the 80s. It was something terrible. You could imagine that they had extra natural bad energy.
Yeah. Let me finish with something. Now I'll say something to the Greek students, to the Greek and Cypriot students here. πριν 20 χρόνια ήμουν στην Αριστοτέλειου Πανεπιστήμιο, στην Σαλόνικα και έμασα την γλώσσα. Έμασα νέα ελληνική γλώσσα.
Ωραία.
Αλλά δυστυχώς δεν έχω αρκετές ευκαιρίες να μιλάω. Και τώρα μπορώ να διαβάζω και βέβαιος με την πώς το λένε, help of λεξικού, the help of dictionary, okay? Και τώρα προτιμώ να μιλάω αγγλικά. So, can I thank you?
Next time when you are going to come to Greece, you are going, with the group, with the students, and we will meet over there. You will be forced to speak only in Greek.
Only Greek. Thank you very much. You were a lovely audience.
For being with us here. It was our honor, our pleasure. I hope the friends from all over have had a good time. Thank you very much. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ που είσαστε εδώ, που είναι και Κυριακή εδώ που τα λέμε. Εδώ στην Κυριακή είναι μια κανονική ημέρα που δουλεύουμε. אני מודה לכם מאוד לכל הסטודנטים שלנו שהגיעו. אנחנו נדבר ביום שלישי הקרוב. θέλω να σας ευχηθώ καλό Πάσχα, να περάσετε ωραία στις γιορτές. Εμείς θα τα πούμε στις 9 Μαΐου που έχουμε την... εμείς έχουμε τη Μεγάλη Δευτέρα. Συγγνώμη, έχουμε αύριο μάθημα. Το έχω ξεχάσει στις 5.30 ώρα. Οπότε οι ευχές θα είναι από αύριο, όχι από τώρα. Σε εύχομαι, θα τα πούμε αύριο.
Last sentence, it was my pleasure. Ήταν ευχαριστήσή μου. Okay, thank you very much.
Και σε εμάς επίσης, also to us. Have a good evening and see you, the Greeks tomorrow, the Israelis after tomorrow, Amίκαμ whenever you want. I am here in Jerusalem. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye. So I'm leaving, okay?
Ναι, και εγώ.